So first of all, for those of you who haven't heard of this term, a SWOT analysis stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. You're saying, let's look internally at what's going on. Those are our strengths and weaknesses. And let's also look externally at what's going on, the opportunities and the threats. A couple problems with it. One, well, it starts with internal. That's the comfort zone. That's the emotional home for most people. I recommend don't start internally. Don't start with what is and what's going on in your familiar boundaries. Start with what's going on in the world around you, right? It's not the strongest of the species that succeed, but the ones that are most adaptive, right? And so in order to be adaptive, you got to know what's going on in that environment around you.
Welcome to the Unleashing Leaders podcast, where we work with willing leaders to accelerate the changes you seek. We'll learn from the experiences of different leaders facing real challenges and distill practical, purposeful steps to apply in your context. I'm Lee Scott, your curious co-pilot. Together, let's make positive changes for our companies and communities.
Hello, and welcome back to the Unleashing Leaders podcast. Today, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. It is just after the start of 2025 here in early January. Hopefully, this podcast will be coming out to a platform near you in the near future. But we're going to do the first of a three-part series focusing on a quintessential leadership competency around vision. One of the biggest differences between a great doer and a great leader is that vision, their ability to see the future, say and share with others what's coming and what we can do about it. I mean, that is just as fundamental to leadership as you can get. And so we're going to break that down into what are kind of the components of that competency and connect it with a few other models that are out there. And then I want to give you three specific tools in each of these episodes that you could facilitate with your particular group of leaders, whether you're an organization that's got 20 employees or 50 employees, or maybe part of the larger organization that you run a particular unit. But these are tools that'll scale all the way up to 12,000 some odd employees. At that point, you start adding on a few other things you got to be thoughtful about. So hopefully this is a practical, good time of the year for you to be thinking about, what is your vision? How are you adapting that to the changing world that we live in? And how do you communicate it powerfully and compellingly for your organizations? So let's take a closer look at it. When you say vision, I mean, one of the oldest quotes I'm familiar with is, where there is no vision, the people perish. That is a biblical quote reference there. And really it's this notion that if we just keep doing what we've always done, given that we live in a world that is constantly changing, yes, without vision, we are likely to perish, or at least be in peril. So when you look at vision and we break it down, what are some of the elements that go into that? I think obviously there is the ability to be able to see things, but I think just as important is the ability to say things. So we're going to kind of use this seeing and saying as kind of our twin powers around this vision competency and kind of decompose that a little bit. Let's focus first on the seeing. I mean, of course, to be able to see what's coming, what is, it really sets up your ability then to be an effective leader and contribute and signal that, the times are changing and we want to be changing with that. And you look at certain leaders like Steve Jobs, for example, who was just an incredible visionary. And that was a superpower that he had. But if you're a visionary, let's say that you can absolutely see that you're tied up on the train tracks, and you can absolutely see that a train is headed directly your way, but you have no ability to really articulate and describe that compellingly to those around you. Doesn't do you much good, right? And so Steve Jobs kind of ran into that challenge earlier in his career. He saw things, and he knew exactly what was coming. He wasn't always right about when it was coming, and sometimes he got a little bit ahead of himself. And he had a harder time at times relaying that and rallying people around it, and he got booted from his own company as a result of it. So, of course, the greatest comeback story, came back, turned things around, and ended up, calling some shots that were way out there that have had an amazing impact on our communities, both probably good and bad. I won't comment on that, but it was absolutely an ability to see what was coming and to see what was possible long before anybody else. And that, of course, is a super important part of vision. I think it's also really important to be able to see where you are. How do we really candidly address the facts about what's actually going on without sugarcoating it and without also, drowning in desperation. I love always the comparisons between the optimistic and the pessimistic viewpoint. Lots of different examples out there. One that I like is, you're out in the ocean, you're in a small boat, you're getting beat up in this really bad storm. The pessimist will say, this is never going to end. Our boat's not big enough. We don't have the equipment we need. My crew sucks. This is not fair. It's out to get me. The storm was created purely because of where I was born or who my parents were or whatever, right? All those things. And I'm not even saying those aren't necessarily true, but just not very helpful, right? To be able to focus on that. The optimist, of course, is, you guys, it's all going to be fine. Everything's going to work out just okay. The storm's going to be over before we know it. We've got everything we need. Everything will be easy. And, maybe that's a little more helpful than the pessimist, but not terribly so, because we're still not focusing on what is and what purposeful actions we could take. The practitioner, the realist, just looks at it and says, yeah, we are in a small boat and maybe we'd like a bigger boat, but it's the boat we got. And yeah, the storm's going on and maybe it's going to last longer than we think, but it won't last forever. Nothing ever does. So really what we got to focus on is taking an inventory of the resources we have and doing the very best we can with what we got, given that this is a challenging circumstance. Let's call it for what it is. And I think that ability to really honestly and candidly and almost ruthlessly, be able to see what truly is and just call it for what it is without as much judgment about whether it's good or bad. It just is, I think, is a prerequisite to be able to then guide your team to say, well, if this is where we are, that's where we want to be, right? And I think that those two skills of being able to see things is kind of part one of the vision. I think the other part of vision we just kind of alluded to is being able to say it. So now, how do you invite input on it? How do you ask other folks to describe the vision possibilities that they see? How do you help them see what's in it for them if we were able to get to that better place over there? That's the communication that is just as important, in fact, almost arguably more important than being able to accurately predict what's coming. If you can be directionally correct, even though you're technically wrong about where you want to be and what trends are coming at you, but you can be awesome at articulating and communicating and asking people to share and contribute to what that's supposed to look like and what we can do about it. I would say that person's going to be far more effective as a leader than the leader who can totally see it but is unable to rally others around it and get their input on it. So being able to describe it, being able to tell stories about it, to share why, that all goes into the second half of being able to be a great visionary. And just because we were saying it, I'm not saying you have to be the source of it, but there needs to be dialogue about it. Oftentimes the value of a leader is asking others to share what you see coming, what trends are on your radar, what's relevant, and then you're triangulating that across your teams. And they could be conflicting perspectives. Some people can say, I think it's going to turn left, and other people can say it's going to turn right. And as a leader, to be able to realize these are possibilities, so they both can exist in the land of future possibilities. It's not like we have to decide which one is going to be. In fact, that might help us create some scenarios for which we compare and try to ready ourselves for it. So that's the saying part of it. Now, those are the two components of this competency of vision. What I want to do now is focus on drilling into some practical tools and some logistical tips and tricks on how you might facilitate or lead a conversation with other leaders in your organization to be able to demonstrate that competency of vision. So there's really kind of three big ones that are out there I would like to share with you guys. Today we're going to start with what we refer to as the environmental scan. And I think that is a prerequisite to be able to facilitate getting a shared seeing of what trends are coming your way in a powerful and productive way. And there's some tools that are out there that I'm not a big fan of. I want to kind of, dissuade you from using those and share some that I have found to be very practical and helpful. Again, with some tips on how you can do it with your teams. The second thing is then how do you either create, if you don't have one, or perhaps update or adapt or revise your mission, vision, purpose, whatever you want to call it. That can be it's an essential thing, but it can be a horrible waste of time. So in our second session in this series, we want to give you some practical tips and tricks on how to do that effectively, efficiently, impactfully, with your teams so that you get, whether it's organizational wide mission vision or it's one specific for your unit or maybe it's for your project, that you can get rallied around, hey, this is where we're headed, and claim that destination powerfully and quickly. And then in the third session, we want to build the bridge between that destination and then the day-to-day actions with this really powerful intermediate level of goal setting around what are called OKRs. It's an oldie but goodies. I know some of you will laugh, like, wasn't that from like the 70s with Intel? Yes, it is. But it's gone through lots of evolution over the years, and it's really penetrating other markets and expanding out there. But it's a very useful midterm bridge between your long-term aspirations and the very practical need to focus and prioritize and get tangible stuff done. So we'll give you a mini primer on objectives and key results in our third module. And, who knows, maybe we'll do a fourth. I'll remain open to possibility there. So for today, let's zoom in on this notion of an environmental scan. So first of all, why not just jump right into an OKR or just jump into a mission update? Couple reasons for that. One, what are the odds that, you're right. You're assuming a lot of people in that room are already seeing what you're seeing. And, that's a huge assumption to make and a very risky one. Also, even if you do see it, and even if you are right, if you don't invest a little bit of time with your teams of being able to describe the environment you're working in, to be able to rationalize why we want to be at a different place than we are now, you're going to encounter a lot more resistance than you would otherwise. Imagine, this bold visionary leader coming in and saying, I've just been hired as the new captain of this unit, and I see these major trends out there, and I think they're going to rock our world, and so that's why we need to invest here, and we need to change here, and we need to shift here. Let's assume that you're right. Let's just set that aside for a second. It's not whether you're right or wrong. Let's just assume that. Everyone in the room is going to now come up with reasons to try to show that you're wrong, or that we don't need to, or it's not relevant, or this is the way we've always done it. So if you start with the solution, and you start with the strategy, and you even start with your answer of your vision, you're just running aground of every ego, significance, resisting, blocking behavior that is present in that team, whether you need to or not. So I don't recommend starting with your bold flag planting. Here's where we need to be. I recommend instead saying, what is going on in the mountains around us? How is the wind and the weather affecting us? Where should we want to be? What are the criteria that would inform that? And there's a couple different tools to do that out there. The classic tool for this is your good old-fashioned SWOT analysis. Now, I'm here to tell you, I absolutely abhor and hate doing them. I've tried to make them work. There is a way to get them to work. I'm not saying they're always bad, but you're just pushing a rope. And I'll tell you why. So first of all, for those of you who haven't heard of this term, a SWOT analysis sounds easy enough, and it is pretty easy. Stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So SWOT. And the notion is actually a good one, in that you're saying, let's look internally at what's going on. Those are our strengths and weaknesses. And let's also look externally at what's going on, right? The opportunities and the threats. And I like that part, the fact that they're trying to get us outside of just looking and navel gazing at what's going on, at the end of our nose, trying to lift our sights out to the external. Couple problems with it. One, well, it starts with internal. That's the comfort zone. That's the emotional home for most people. I recommend don't start, internally. Don't start with, what is and what's going on in the familiar boundaries. Start with what's going on in the world around you, right? It's not the strongest of the species that succeed, but the ones that are most adaptive, right? And so in order to be adaptive, you got to know what's going on in that environment around you. So if you were doing a SWOT, at least don't start with the strengths and weaknesses. Start external. The bigger issue that I found with this SWOT is that it's fundamentally based on and starts from judgment. Right now, again, judgment's not a bad thing necessarily, but prejudgment is. And so you're saying, hey, what's good and what's bad? What's strong or opportunities? What's a weakness or a threat? You're starting the categories with what's good or bad. And if you're asking your brain to tell you what's good or bad, the brain must have already had a chance to think about that and come up with a conclusion whether it's good or bad. So it's not going to see stuff that you haven't been thinking about or looking at. It's only going to see things and share things that you're already familiar with. So you're limiting your range of vision when you do that. And who cares whether it's good or bad? I mean, it's like, to be able to say this is good, this is bad, I don't know if it's going to be good or bad. It just is. Back to that pessimistic versus the optimistic, the wind in the storm isn't good or bad. It just is. And so is it an opportunity? Is it a threat? Is it a strength or a weakness? Like, I don't freaking care. It just is. So I don't like the artificial starting with judgment. I'd rather describe what we see is happening or what might happening, and then determine what we're going to do about it without judging it. Like inflation is bad, inflation is good. It's like, no, just inflation happens, people. And there's reasons it happens, and we can argue whether those reasons are good reasons or bad reasons. We can argue about the consequences of those things. But depending on which side of the ledger you're on, it could be good for you or bad for you, right? Inflation is great for debt holders, right? It makes the value of your debt go down. It basically pays it for you. It's terrible for anybody who's, got to buy groceries. So, is it good or is it bad? That's a dumb argument. And then practically with the SWOT analysis, I usually just see it ends up being a fairly low distinction generating content. So, the typical outcome of a SWOT analysis is like, well, we looked at our strengths and we decided that our people are our strength. We got strong people. Yeah, well, strong. Okay, everybody agrees to that. But our weakness is we don't have enough of them. And frankly, some of them are kind of, dumb. And they need to be skilled up and trained. So that's our weakness, right? So we got to deal with that. Okay, everyone nods sagely. Okay, sure. The opportunity we have is to hire some good ones, right? But the threat is, man, the labor market's really tough and we don't have money. And that's all maybe even true. It's not very useful. It's not helpful. It's like, duh, that's like saying gravity makes things go down. Like, that's not new information, people. It's not a powerful distinction. So for those reasons, I'm not a big fan of the SWOT. So here I'm telling you what not to do. Maybe I should offer an alternative, of what you could do. And so there's lots of different things you could do, but I'm a big fan of what's called environmental scanning, where you're looking at categories of the world around you and identifying what are the trends there, and then deciding, what you might do about it, or maybe even looking at permutations of different scenarios with it. So a little blend of scenario planning and environmental scanning kind of blended together. A lot of different models out there. The first step for me is picking the categories that you'd like to have your team focus on. There's step analysis, steep analysis, pestle analysis. There's a bunch of different acronyms. I'm a big fan of the steep analysis for most industries. Feel free to customize. But these are just categories. These are the components of what's going on in the world around you. Porter's 5 forces might be another model you might want to consider. But a steep analysis just essentially says that, hey, the world around us is composed of 5 major categories where trends might live and lurk. The S stands for sociocultural. And that is looking at what are norms and changes around our people, right? And so that could be our customers, that could be our suppliers, that could be our employees. But what are the trends going on? Is population growing or is it shrinking in our geography? Is the population for this market growing or shrinking? What are the norms and preferences and assumptions that are happening within that? Are there generational differences that are starting to manifest? Are there new populations we want to go after? So that's the sociocultural domain. The T in steep stands for the technology, and that is, currently would be things like the emergence of artificial intelligence, AI, be able to leverage blockchain to be able to do peer-to-peer trustless transactions, cybersecurity challenges that are presented, data storage and data analytics. But it's not just information technology. It's also physical technology. We have some great breakthroughs happening in fusion technology, small modular nuclear reactors, renewable energy, battery storage, on the whole energy side of the house. Maybe it's a manufacturing breakthrough. We have a new way of being able to assemble certain components, or there's this new rig we could get that, cuts time in half for how we do a particular step in our process. Maybe it's a pharmaceutical breakthrough. Maybe it's a biochemical breakthrough, right? This is all technological. So what are the trends going on? Hey, we've got, this new stuff going on with these CRISPR editors and our protein mappings that we're able to predict and analyze far rapidly than we've ever done before. That might be relevant in a pharmaceutical industry, for example. So that's all the technology. The first E, or one of the E's, is the economy. What's going on with the economy? That includes things like monetary policy, unemployment, macro GDP changes, what's going on in terms of the supply chain relationship. So those are all really good economic trends to ask about and look at. And some of them aren't relevant for years on end, and then suddenly they blow up in your face. A couple of years ago, monetary policy was something nobody ever really thought about. I'm kind of an economics geek, so I'm always paying attention to it, but it still caught me fairly flat-footed. When inflation, started to really jump, like we knew it was coming, we were surprised it hadn't come yet. But man, when the Fed just slammed those interest rates, by 300% or whatever over the course of 6 months, that created some shockwaves, at least in our industry. And so, had we not been paying attention to that, it could have been far worse. It was still tough, but at least we kind of saw it coming. And so we did what we could to get ready for it and prepare ourselves, both financially and with our marketing and with our outreach. So that's economic. Of course, unemployment is a big one that gets talked about more regularly. But what's going on there? The next E is the environment. And this is looking at the environment both as the ultimate supplier and receiver of all of our physical products. So what materials are you looking for? Where are those materials located? It also is looking at things like, weather-related challenges, potential disruptions to supply chain accordingly. We've been getting pounded with wildfires out here in the western side of the United States. There's flooding in other parts of the world. There's hurricanes. So extreme weather, disruptive weather, changes in climate. Again, I won't get into who causes it or what is caused by it, but the fact is, it is volatile, right? It changes. And so if you're assuming it will always be the same and every spring will be the same and every fall will be the same, you are asking for trouble. So what's going on in the environment with, biodiversity and our waste stream management and our energy supply sources, all of that kind of falls under that domain. And then the last is a P, and that stands for political. Some people call it political and legal, whatever. But it's, what's going on with our government partners out there. So is there a shift in administrative priorities? Is there a shift in focus? What's going on with, macro political, geopolitical conditions and wars and crises? And maybe it's a local thing going on with regulations in your industry, even not necessarily elected officials. Maybe it's an industry regulation thing that, the association of, United such and suches have decided we're going to do this particular thing because it's good for our industry. So those are all sources of, external political factors that may or may not rock your organization's world. Now, sometimes people call this economics the dismal science because when you start looking at these things, it's real easy to get overwhelmed and kind of a little dark about it. It's like, man, the world's kind of going to heck, and it's like, look, it just is. The world's always been a challenge. Imagine what it was like in medieval times. Imagine what it was like during World War I. Imagine what it was like during World War II. In every era and every stage, we all feel like this is the end as we know it and it's never going to be the same. And yet, humanity turns out to be pretty darn resilient. So my perspective is this, look at it, see it, and then be able to say, hey, yeah, inflation might be kicking our butt right now. Maybe our supply chain might be disrupted from some ecological factors. Maybe the social norms of our customers are changing. Let's just name those things and then decide what we want to do about it. Now, we'll close with some logistics on, okay, we have this great concepts, but like how in practice might I put it together? And again, you got lots of options here. I thought I would just give you a couple of ones to think about. So for this example, I want to assume that, you've got a 50-ish employee organizational unit. Maybe it's your own business and that's the whole crew. Maybe you're a division leader of a larger organization and your squad happens to be around 50 some odd people, right? Maybe it's 20, maybe it's 500, but let's just use this for the example. And let's say that, maybe you've got, 5 to 8 or so specific people in positions of management and certain responsibilities. So yeah, you might want to include them. Maybe there are some key thought leaders or key contributors or just people who really are out there and have their finger on the pulse. Or maybe they're up and coming and emerging. You want to include them too. So let's say out of that 50 people, there's 10, maybe 12 that you'd like to gather and really get some shared mind space around what are the visual trends that we see coming at us and likely to create both challenges and opportunities. Frankly, we don't care. It might be both. So you've got that crew. Maybe you've got a standing quarterly, touch base on certain things that you have most of them. You invite a few other ones to that particular session. Maybe you schedule an ad hoc, twice a year where you're doing these types of things. But you get them there, and the invitation ahead of time is to ask them to be like, hey, I want you to get outside of our business for a moment and think about what's going on in the world around us. What's affecting our customer's customer? What's affecting our supplier's supplier, right? And give them the steep categories and say, hey, these are some areas we might be looking at so they can think about it in advance. Then you get there, let's say you carve out, 90 minutes for this thing, for example. I might open up with saying, hey, it's really important that whatever we do as a company is responsive and adaptive to the changing circumstances around it. And while we cannot predict what they'll be, we can at least prepare ourselves mentally for what they could be, and then look at what common ground there are to inform the priorities that we make as a company, right? So that's your intro. And then I love to do a little bit of a World Cafe style here. And I've done this in banking. I've done this in healthcare. I've done this in law enforcement. I've done this with indigenous groups. There's kind of a unanimous humanity about doing this way. It's very interactive, very fast, very efficient, and fun. But the idea might be, you got 5 stations around the room, or if you're doing this virtually, right, you got 5 breakout groups, that's fine. And you've got the categories all kind of positioned around it. And you're like, all right, let's say there's 10, 12 people. There's 5 categories. Maybe we pair up in 2s or 3s and we split up and cover all 5 categories. If you don't have enough people to do that, maybe you do 3 of the categories for a couple rounds, then you do the other 2 or 3 categories for a couple of rounds. So again, logistically, sort that out based on what makes sense for your crew. But the notion is that in round 1, let's say myself and somebody else are paired up and we're on the socio-cultural category. And so in round 1, we're just looking at, hey, in this space, what are some of the major trends that are happening in the world, right? It's like, well, hey, we've got, continued shifts in generational preferences that are happening. We got a really tight labor market out there still. Our customer buying preferences, they've kind of shifted from a one size fits all where everybody wants their micro customization. Their expectation is they get it now, they get it for free. So these are things that might be happening in your area. So we're just jotting these down, capturing on the flip chart. And then we go, okay, well, here's 5 or 6 things that are happening. We have an aging population. If maybe that's relevant in your industry. And so you're like, okay, 5 or 6 things. And then we would say, okay, of these, what are 2 to 3 that are most relevant for our business? It's like, that generational stuff doesn't really apply to us. I mean, it's happening, but it doesn't really apply to us. With this aging population part, like we have more and more people that are going to be entering into the niche where they're going to need our services. Great. So we'll circle that one and circle another one. Okay, that's round 1. Maybe that's 5-7 minutes. Then one of you would stay and the other one would rotate to another station, right? So maybe I stay this round and my partner goes off to ecology, for example. And I gain the person from political because he needed to break from that, let's be honest. And so I kind of share quickly, like, here's what we were talking about with the major trends. Any other ones that you're seeing out there? Like, no, those are the big ones. Like, cool. We kind of thought these 2 were most relevant. And they're like, yeah, they are. But I think this one, a little bit of debate there. Maybe we make some adjustments. And whether you do this in round 2 or round 3, that this now to shift from like, now let's take these 2 and let's run a couple scenarios. All right. So let's assume we're doing an economic one. I think that can relate more easily to more folks. And so we said, yeah, we think inflation is still a really big challenge for us and our customers. Okay, great. Well, scenario 1 is that inflation continues to slowly ratchet back down, get in control, and we achieve the soft landing that the Fed has been advocating for over the last several years. They're like, okay, that's scenario 1. Scenario 2 is it becomes really sticky and persistent and maybe even starts crawling back up, maybe even spikes back up because some other crisis happens and we print a bunch of money we probably shouldn't be printing, and there's more challenges with that. All right. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen. I'm saying what could happen. I'm using my vision to see possibilities, not predict what will happen. There's a difference between those 2 things. And maybe the third one is, maybe it just seizes, right? I mean, it flips from being inflationary to deflationary, man. We get really caught and we dive into a recession, right? So those are the 3 permutations we might have for the inflation one. Or maybe we've got this aging population. It's like, okay, they're aging population, but they continue to not realize they need the services that we have, for example. Or there's an emerging competitor that comes in who captures their attention and hoodwinks them and draws them all away from us. So whatever those scenarios might be, right? So you're expanding the range of what's possible to kind of prep your brain from a resilience perspective. So that's round 2 or 3. Maybe you do one last round and you say, okay, given inflation has 3 ways that it can go, what might be some options about how we could respond to it? Now, we're not trying to solve it. We're not trying to say whether it's good or bad. We're just saying, what might we do with it? And so, okay, well, if inflation really does blow up again, we are going to have to be really crucially cautious about our cash reserves. We're going to have to make sure that we are monitoring our debt financing strategy if we're doing that. I'm not a big fan of it myself personally, but it does make sense in some industries, I'm sure. So yeah, like those options. So we should do A and B if that happens. If it comes down to a soft landing, maybe we don't have to worry so much about, strategy B, but we probably still want to be doing strategy A anyways. So let's stick with that. And then if it reverses course, becomes deflationary, we dive into recession, then maybe we should be considering these other things, right? Options D and E. And as we look at those options, again, we're not trying to say this is what we should do and this is what we will do. We're saying what could we do? Remember, we're visionarying right now. We're visualizing that future possibilities. And you might find that, regardless of what actually happens, there's a couple of things in there that are common denominators regardless that we probably should just be doing anyways. And maybe this other thing we want to have, queued up and ready if the conditions change, but let's not spend a lot of money on it if the conditions haven't yet. And so that now starts to really inform what we're going to talk about next in terms of our goals and our strategies and our objectives. So anyways, you do a couple of rounds of that, very quick, very interactive, lots of people talking, lots of deep thoughts and reflections, lots of stuff that may or may not be relevant, but people are just getting it out. And the focus is not on us. The focus is on the world around us. And that's a hugely important shift to get in your leaders' minds, which usually is focused on deadlines and production and customers screaming at you. So very valuable time spent. Now you report out and folks have a chance to kind of share this. These are the major trends. We think these two are most relevant. And here's our scenarios for each of those two and some possible levers that we could pull to inform our prioritization. Awesome. Right. And again, we're not solving the answers. We're not predicting the future. We're exploring what we might be able to see. And now we have a shared vision about what we see. We all see these things coming. So later on, when we start talking about, okay, which of these are we going to choose to focus on? Which of these are we going to prioritize and get done? It's now not me convincing you we should do it. You see why we should do it. You know full well why we should do it because this trend is coming square at us. And if we don't get off the X, it's going to crush us. So there's less of the change management that has to happen to get folks on board with the subsequent strategies. So that's it for us today, you guys. We wanted to share a little bit about the construct of vision, that it involves both being able to see things and being able to say things and listen to those things associated with what other people are saying. And then we've teed up one of the first practices you might use, which is an environmental scan, to be able to get your team outside of just thinking about their own world and their own little pity parties and looking at the world around us. So we can now have some informed dialogue and comparisons about, well, do we want to have an aggressive marketing strategy or do we want to stick with the status quo? We can now say, well, which one makes the most sense based on these scenarios versus it just being, I think that's a good idea or I think that's a bad idea. We're like, no, which is the adaptive idea? Next up, we'll take a look at how could you efficiently and effectively create, if you haven't already had one, or how maybe you update and revise one if it's been around for a while and the world is changing and it's ready for you to polish it up. Your mission, vision, and or purpose statement. We'll clarify some distinctions between those and once again give you some practical takeaways that you as a leader can facilitate with your team. Good time of the year to be doing this, you guys. Happy New Year. Great to be back with you all. And we look forward to sharing more insights at our next session.
Thank you for joining us today on the Unleashing Leaders podcast. Subscribe so you don't miss a moment that could be the key to your next breakthrough. Let's stay connected and contribute together by grabbing that @Unleashing Leaders handle on LinkedIn, YouTube, or your favorite network. This is Lee Scott. Keep learning, loving, and leading. Our future and our communities are counting on us.